"Step out of the truck, ma'am, now." The knock came sharp against the glass, cutting through the low hum of diesel engines and distant highway noise like a blade through still air. And for a fraction of a second, Danielle Brooks didn't move, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes fixed forward as the red and blue lights painted the inside of her cab in slow, pulsing waves, the kind that made everything feel unreal, like time itself had been stretched thin. The rest stop sat somewhere off Interstate 40, just past mile marker 182, quiet except for a few idling rigs and the flicker of sodium lamps overhead, their pale yellow glow reflecting off chrome and asphalt. And in that suspended moment, Danielle inhaled slowly, controlled, measured, the way she had trained herself to do when the world pressed in too close, because this wasn't just a stop, it wasn't just another long-haul checkpoint with an officer looking to pass time or assert authority. And she knew it, not from instinct alone but from the faint vibration tucked beneath her collar, a whisper of encrypted signal pressing lightly against her skin, barely there but unmistakable, and then the voice, low and precise, threading through the hidden earpiece no one could see. "Target is 2 miles behind you, maintain position." And just like that, the night shifted, the weight of the situation settling deeper into her chest, not fear, not panic, but calculation. Outside, Officer Ryan Cole adjusted his stance, one hand resting near his belt, the other tapping. Again on the glass, more impatient this time, his silhouette framed by the glare of his cruiser's lights, a figure used to being obeyed, used to people stepping out, explaining themselves, folding under pressure, and from where he stood, all he saw was a black woman in a worn trucker's jacket, alone, parked longer than he liked at a rest stop that had seen its share of trouble, and that was enough for him, enough to justify the suspicion already forming in his mind. Inside the cab, Danielle finally turned her head, slow, deliberate, her gaze meeting his through the glass, calm and unreadable, as if she were observing him rather than the other way around. And, for a brief second, something in that stillness didn't sit right, but Cole pushed it aside, leaning closer, his voice raised just enough to carry, "License and registration, please." The words clipped routine, yet edged with something firmer, something that suggested this wasn't a request so much as an expectation. Danielle reached for the visor, retrieving her documents with unhurried precision, every movement controlled, every second accounted for, because somewhere behind her, out on that dark stretch of highway, a vehicle was closing in, one she had been tracking for over 300 miles, one that carried more than just cargo, and the last thing she needed was to lose it because of a roadside stop that should have never happened. The radio crackled faintly in Cole's cruiser, a background murmur he ignored as he took her license, scanning it under the harsh beam of his flashlight, his brow tightening just slightly, not because anything was wrong, but because something about her composure didn't match the scenario he had already decided this was, and that dissonance made him dig deeper. "You been drinking tonight?" he asked, casual on the surface, probing underneath, while Danielle simply shook her head once, her voice even when she spoke. "No, sir." Nothing defensive, nothing exaggerated, just a statement, clean and direct. A gust of wind moved through the lot, rustling loose papers near a nearby rig, the sound faint but noticeable in the otherwise heavy quiet. And for a moment, everything seemed to pause again, suspended between what was happening and what was about to unfold, because back inside Danielle's ear, the voice returned, quieter now, tighter. "He's approaching the exit ramp 1 mile." And her fingers tightened ever so slightly around the edge of the seat, a small shift, almost invisible, but enough to ground her, to remind her of the line she was walking, the balance between staying invisible and staying in control. Cole handed the license back, his expression set, his decision already made. "Mind if I take a look inside your trailer?" he asked, though the way he said it made it clear he wasn't expecting a refusal, and Danielle held his gaze. For a beat longer than necessary, the weight of everything pressing into that single second, before she answered, her tone unchanged, steady as the hum of the engine beneath her. "On what grounds, officer?" And just like that, the air shifted again, subtle but undeniable, the kind of shift that happens right before something breaks open, though neither of them could fully see it yet. Not the approaching headlights in the distance, not the quiet storm gathering just beyond the edge of that dimly lit rest stop, waiting for the moment when control would slip and everything would turn. The question hung between them, thin but unbreakable, and for the first time since he stepped out of his cruiser, Officer Ryan Cole did not answer immediately. His jaw tightening just slightly as the yellow overhead light caught the edge of his badge, reflecting a dull glint across the side of the truck, and Danielle remained still inside the cab, her posture relaxed but deliberate, her hands resting loosely now, not defensive, not aggressive, just present, as if she had already measured the moment and found her footing within it. A semi rolled past on the far side of the lot, its tires humming low against the asphalt, the sound stretching out into the night before fading into the distance, and somewhere beyond that darkness, beyond the exit ramp and the slow curve of the highway, the approaching vehicle continued its steady path, closing the gap mile by mile, unseen but not unfelt, and inside Danielle's ear, the faint signal pulsed again, softer this time. Half a mile, followed by a brief flicker of static, then silence, and she did not react outwardly, did not glance away or shift her weight, because even the smallest deviation could tip the balance she had worked hours to maintain. Cole took a step back from the cab, his boots scraping lightly against the gravel edge of the parking line, buying himself a second, then another as he recalibrated, not because he had changed his mind, but because something about her tone had forced him to reconsider how he approached the situation, and he was not a man who liked to feel off balance, not even slightly, so he straightened, shoulders squared, voice firm when he spoke again. "You have been parked here longer than usual for a rest stop this size, and I have reason to believe there may be irregular activity." The phrasing formal, almost rehearsed, as if structure could reinforce authority, and Danielle listened without interruption, her gaze steady, absorbing every word, every inflection, every pause, because those details mattered more than anything else right now. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of hot rubber and diesel fuel, mixing with the sterile hum of the fluorescent lights above, and in that layered quiet, Danielle made her decision, subtle but decisive, choosing not to escalate, not to push further than necessary, because the mission did not allow for ego, only precision. "I understand your concern, officer," she said evenly, her voice calm, grounded. "But I am on a scheduled route, and I have documentation to support that." Her words neither submissive nor confrontational, simply factual, a line drawn without raising her voice, and Cole watched her closely, searching for cracks that did not appear, his instincts telling him to press harder, to assert control before the situation slipped into something undefined. And yet there was no clear opening, nothing obvious to justify the escalation he felt building inside him. A car door slammed somewhere across the lot, the sharp sound echoing briefly before dissolving into the open air, and Danielle's focus did not waver. Though her awareness sharpened, every sense tuned not just to the man in front of her, but to the environment as a whole, the angles of movement, the rhythm of distant engines, the pattern of headlights reflecting off metal surfaces, and then she saw it, just at the far edge of the entrance road, a pair of headlights cresting the slight incline, low and steady, not drawing attention, not speeding, just arriving, and her pulse shifted, not faster, but deeper, anchoring her in the exact center of the moment. Cole followed her line of sight for a fraction of a second before snapping his attention back, misreading the glance as distraction, and that was enough for him, enough to move forward with the next step he had already decided on. "I am going to need you to open the trailer," he said, more direct now, less pretense, his hand gesturing toward the back of the rig, and Danielle held his gaze again, that same quiet intensity settling into the space between them, the kind that did not raise alarms but did not fade either, and for a brief second, something in Cole's expression shifted, not doubt exactly, but hesitation, the smallest fracture in certainty, quickly covered, quickly dismissed, because he had already committed to this path. Inside Danielle's ear, the signal returned, sharper now, urgent without being loud, target entering lot. And everything aligned at once, the timing, the positioning, the narrowing window of opportunity, and she knew with absolute clarity that the next few seconds would determine whether the operation held or collapsed, and still, outwardly, she remained composed, her voice steady as she spoke again. "Officer, if there is no warrant or probable cause beyond what you have stated, I would prefer to continue my route." And the words landed clean, precise, not challenging, but not yielding either, and as the distant headlights moved closer, washing faint light across the edge of the lot, the tension tightened, invisible but unmistakable, stretching between authority and restraint, between assumption and truth, waiting for the exact moment when one would give way to the other. The words settled into the space between them like a line drawn in sand, and for a moment neither of them moved, the distant headlights now rolling slowly into the rest stop, their glow stretching across the asphalt in long, pale streaks that brushed the side of Danielle's trailer without announcing themselves. Just another vehicle arriving, just another presence in a place built for passing through, and yet everything inside her sharpened, every sense narrowing into a single point of awareness. As the low hum of that engine blended into the background noise of idling trucks and flickering lights, Officer Ryan Cole exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. But there was a shift in him now, subtle but undeniable, the kind that came when authority met. Resistance that did not look like resistance at all, and it unsettled him more than outright defiance ever could, because she was not raising her voice, not arguing, not giving him anything obvious to push against, and that forced him into a corner he did not like, one where he had to choose between backing off or stepping further in without clear footing. He glanced briefly toward the incoming vehicle again, a dark sedan easing into the far row near the vending machines, its headlights dimming. As it rolled to a stop, engine still running, and something about the timing pulled at him, but not enough to connect the pieces, not enough to override the narrative he had already built in his mind. So he turned back, decision made, voice firmer now. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, no longer asking, the tone carrying weight, expectation, routine enforcement. Inside the cab, Danielle felt the shift like a change in pressure, not unexpected, just sooner than ideal, and the voice in her ear returned, quieter now but tighter. "Maintain position, do not break cover," followed by a brief pause that stretched just long enough to matter. "We are watching." And she knew what that meant, knew the margin had narrowed, knew that any misstep here could ripple outward into consequences she could not fully control, and still, she opened the door. The metal creaked softly as it swung outward, the cool night air slipping into the cab as Danielle stepped down onto the asphalt, her boots landing with a muted sound that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness, and for the first time, the two of them stood face to face without glass between them, the overhead light casting a pale wash across her features, calm, composed, unreadable, and Cole studied her more closely now, taking in the details he had not noticed before, the steadiness of her posture, the absence of hesitation, the way her eyes did not dart or avoid but held steady, not confrontational, just present, and, again, that faint dissonance surfaced, the sense that something did not fully align with his expectations. The sedan in the distance idled quietly, its silhouette barely distinguishable against the darker edge of the lot, and Danielle did not look at it, did not acknowledge it in any visible way, though every part of her remained aware of its position, its timing, its role in the sequence unfolding. Cole gestured toward the back of the truck, his movements sharper now, more deliberate, as if reinforcing his control through action. "Let us take a look," he said, and Danielle turned slightly, not toward the trailer, but just enough to reposition herself, placing her body between him and the direct line of sight to the rear doors, a subtle adjustment, almost imperceptible, but intentional, and her voice remained even when she spoke. "Officer, I have complied with your request to step out, but I still need a lawful reason for further inspection." The words precise, measured, leaving no room for misinterpretation. A faint flicker of irritation crossed Cole's expression, quick and controlled, but present, because now it was no longer just about procedure, it was about maintaining authority. In a situation that refused to bend easily, and he shifted his stance again, scanning the area briefly as if searching for reinforcement in the environment itself. But the other trucks remained still, their drivers unseen, their engines low and indifferent, and the sedan remained parked, quiet, unremarkable, just another shadow in the lot. Inside Danielle's ear, the signal came one more time, sharper now, almost cutting through the quiet. "Stand by." And she felt it, the exact point where everything converged, the tension tightening not just between her and the officer, but across the entire scene, as if the air itself were holding its breath, waiting for the next move, and she did not rush it, did not force it, because timing was everything, and right now, timing was the only thing that could turn this from a disruption into an opportunity, or from control into collapse. And as the faint sound of a car door opening echoed from across the lot, barely audible but unmistakable, Danielle remained exactly where she was, steady, grounded, holding the line in a moment that was no longer just about a traffic stop, but about something much larger unfolding just beneath the surface. The faint echo of that distant car door closing folded into the night like a quiet signal, and Danielle felt it settle into her awareness with precision. Not urgency, just confirmation that the timeline had tightened exactly as expected, and still she did not turn, did not shift her gaze away from Officer Ryan Cole, who now stood a few feet in front of her with a posture that had grown more rigid, more insistent, as though the lack of compliance he anticipated had already become part of the story he was telling himself. The overhead lights flickered once, a subtle pulse that cast brief shadows across the asphalt, stretching the lines of the truck and the cruiser into something longer, something less defined, and in that momentary distortion, Cole took a step closer, reducing the space between them, his voice dropping slightly, not louder, but heavier. "I am not going to repeat myself," he said, the words measured, controlled, but carrying the weight of expectation, and Danielle absorbed it. Without reaction, her breathing steady, her shoulders relaxed, her stance grounded in a way that did not challenge but did not yield, and that balance, that quiet refusal to be pulled into escalation, pressed against him in a way he could not easily categorize. Across the lot, the dark sedan remained still, its engine idling low, almost indistinguishable from the surrounding hum, but now there was movement near it, subtle, contained, a figure stepping out and pausing just long enough to scan the environment before beginning to walk, not hurried, not hesitant, just deliberate, blending into the natural flow of a traveler crossing a rest stop, and Danielle registered it without looking, mapping distance and timing in the back of her mind, aligning it with the steady rhythm of everything else unfolding around her. Cole shifted again, his attention flicking briefly over her shoulder as if something in the air had caught his instinct, but he did not turn fully, did not break focus, because control required presence, and presence meant staying locked on the subject in front of him, and so he continued, his tone sharpening just slightly. "If you have nothing to hide, then this should not be a problem." The familiar phrase landing between them like a test, one he expected to pass easily, and Danielle's eyes held his, calm and unwavering, as she answered. "Respectfully, officer, my compliance does not remove the need for lawful cause." Her voice even, precise, carrying no edge beyond clarity, and for a brief second, the words hung there, not confrontational, but firm enough to disrupt the pattern he was trying to enforce. A truck engine roared to life somewhere behind them, the sudden rise in sound breaking the thin layer of quiet before settling back into a steady rumble. And in that brief interruption, Danielle's awareness sharpened again, the figure from the sedan now closer, moving along the outer edge of the lot, staying within the natural paths of foot traffic, unremarkable to anyone not looking closely. And she knew the window was narrowing, not in minutes, but in seconds. Inside her ear, the signal returned, barely audible. "Stand steady." Followed by a pause that stretched just long enough to feel intentional, and she understood the message beneath the words, that this moment was not about forcing progress but about holding position until the exact point of convergence. And so she did, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, her attention anchored both in front of her and beyond him at the same time. Cole exhaled again, slower this time, as if recalibrating once more, his hand resting near his belt not out of threat but habit, a gesture of control. He had repeated countless times in situations far less complicated than this, and yet something about this interaction refused to resolve cleanly, refused to fit into the pattern he expected, and that unsettled him in ways he could not fully articulate, so he leaned into authority again, voice firm. "Turn around and place your hands where I can see them." The instruction clear, direct, leaving little room for interpretation, and Danielle did not move immediately, not out of defiance, but because timing had reached its edge, because the faint sound of footsteps approaching from behind had aligned perfectly with the rhythm she had been tracking since the moment the headlights first appeared. And in that suspended second, where instruction met stillness, where expectation met control, the air seemed to tighten just enough to signal that whatever came next would not follow the path either of them had anticipated. And still, Danielle remained exactly where she was, steady, composed, holding the center of a moment that was about to shift in a way neither silence nor authority could contain. "Turn around," Officer Ryan Cole repeated, the words firmer now, edged with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance, and the space between them tightened just enough to make the moment feel smaller, more contained, as if everything outside of it had faded into a distant hum. Danielle did not move right away, not because she was resisting, but because the timing had reached a point where every fraction of a second mattered, and behind her the soft, steady rhythm of footsteps continued to close the distance across the asphalt, measured, unhurried, blending seamlessly into the quiet activity of the rest stop, yet carrying a presence that shifted the air in a way only she seemed to register. The overhead lights buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow that flattened shadows and sharpened outlines, and in that stark illumination, Cole's posture grew more rigid, his stance widening slightly as if anchoring himself deeper into the moment. "Ma'am, I am giving you a lawful order," he said, his voice controlled but pressing, and Danielle finally moved, slowly, deliberately, turning just enough to comply without surrendering her awareness. Her hands lifting into view, open, steady, her movements precise and unhurried, as if she were following a rhythm only she could hear. The air cooled slightly as a breeze moved through the lot, carrying with it the distant sound of a passing vehicle on the highway, a low rush that came and went in seconds, and in that brief wash of sound, the figure from the sedan stepped fully into the edge of the light, still several yards away, still outside the immediate focus of the scene, but now undeniably present, and Danielle felt the alignment click into place. Not relief, not release, just the quiet recognition that the moment had arrived. Cole's eyes tracked her hands, then her shoulders, then the slight turn of her body, his attention fixed on control, on procedure, on maintaining the structure he had established, and yet something beneath that surface continued to pull at him. A subtle unease he could not quite define. The sense that the situation was no longer contained within the boundaries he understood, and he took another step forward, closing the gap further. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he added, reinforcing the command, reinforcing himself, and Danielle held that position, her breathing even, her gaze angled just slightly downward now, not submissive, but measured, calculated, every detail intentional. Inside her ear, the signal returned one last time, quiet but unmistakable, "Stand by now," and the word landed with finality, not loud, not urgent, but absolute, and in that same instant, the footsteps behind her stopped. There was a shift, subtle but immediate, as if the entire scene had tilted, just a few degrees off its axis, and Cole felt it before he saw it. His attention flicking past Danielle's shoulder for a fraction of a second, drawn by something he had not consciously registered until it was already there, and when he turned, just slightly, just enough to break his fixed focus, he saw the man standing a few feet behind them, calm, composed, dressed like any other traveler passing through, and yet there was something in his posture, in the stillness of his presence, that did not match the environment. Danielle did not turn, did not acknowledge him outwardly, her hands still raised, her body still aligned with Cole's instructions, but the energy of the moment had shifted completely, the tension no longer centered on compliance or suspicion, but on something broader, something that expanded beyond the narrow frame of a roadside stop. Cole's expression tightened, his authority instinctively reasserting itself as he addressed the new presence. "Sir, I need you to step back." The words firm, controlled, but carrying a note of uncertainty that had not been there before, and the man did not immediately respond, did not challenge, did not retreat. He simply stood there, steady, observant, as if he had arrived exactly where he intended to be. The hum of engines, the flicker of lights, the distant rush of the highway all seemed to fold into a quieter background, leaving the three of them suspended in a moment that no longer followed the expected pattern, and Danielle remained exactly as she was, still, composed, her role unchanged on the surface, but everything beneath it now aligned with a different reality, one that was about to reveal itself not through force or noise, but through the quiet shift of control from one set of hands to another, and in that fragile, precise second, the balance tipped, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a certainty that could not be undone. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, dense, like the air itself had weight, and Danielle held her position exactly as it was, hands visible, shoulders relaxed, her breathing steady and controlled as the faint hum of engines and distant highway noise seemed to fade into something softer, something almost distant, as if the world had stepped back to watch what would happen next. Officer Ryan Cole's focus shifted completely now, no longer fixed on Danielle, but drawn toward the man standing behind her, and there was a brief pause, a fraction of a second where instinct and uncertainty collided, where training met something it did not fully recognize, and in that pause, the balance of the moment shifted just enough to be felt but not yet understood. The overhead light flickered again, casting a pale wash across all three of them, and the man's face came into clearer view, calm, composed, his expression neutral in a way that did not invite confrontation or retreat, just presence, and Cole straightened slightly, his voice firm but edged now with something more cautious. "I said step back, sir." And the words landed, but they did not carry the same certainty as before, not the same automatic control that had defined every moment leading up to this. The man did not move immediately, did not challenge, did not resist. He simply reached into the inside of his jacket with a slow, deliberate motion, one that carried no urgency, no threat, just intention, and Danielle felt the shift settle deeper, the exact point where everything moved from tension into clarity, and still she did not turn, did not lower her hands, because the timing was no longer hers to control. Cole's posture tightened, his attention narrowing on the movement, his instincts flaring just enough to sharpen his focus, but not enough to escalate, and in that narrow space between reaction and restraint, the man withdrew a small, dark leather wallet and held it out, not aggressively, not defensively, just within view, the motion steady, precise, and the quiet authority of it did more than any raised voice could have done. For a brief second, no one spoke, the object held between them like a key to something unspoken, and then the man's voice came, low even, carrying a calm that did not need to assert itself. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said, the words simple, unadorned, and yet they landed with a weight that shifted the entire frame of the moment. The hum of the rest stop seemed to return all at once, the distant engines, the flicker of lights, the quiet movement of air, but everything felt different now, as if the scene had been recast in an instant, and Cole's expression changed, not dramatically, not with shock or disbelief, but with a subtle tightening around the eyes, a recalibration that happened beneath the surface, the kind that came when a situation no longer fit the assumptions it had been built on. Danielle remained still for another second, her hands still raised, her posture unchanged, allowing the shift to complete itself fully, to settle into place without interruption, and then slowly, deliberately, she lowered her hands, the motion smooth, controlled, as if nothing about it was rushed or reactive, just a natural conclusion to a moment that had reached its end. The man stepped forward just enough to close the distance, his presence aligning with Danielle's without needing acknowledgement, without needing explanation, and Cole glanced between them, the connection forming not through words, but through the quiet certainty in their posture, in their composure, in the way neither of them needed to fill the silence with anything more. A breeze moved through the lot again, lighter this time, carrying with it the faint scent of asphalt and fuel, and Danielle finally turned her head slightly, just enough to meet the man's presence without fully shifting her stance. Her expression calm, grounded, as if this had always been the direction the moment was moving toward. Cole exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it carried the weight of understanding beginning to form, not fully realized, not yet complete, but present enough to change everything that followed, and for the first time since the stop began, the authority in his posture softened, not lost, but adjusted, recalibrated to a reality that had just expanded beyond the narrow scope of a routine check, and in that quiet recalibration, the tension that had defined the entire encounter did not disappear. It transformed, settling into something more measured, more controlled, as the night resumed its steady rhythm around them, unchanged on the surface, but entirely different underneath. The word FBI did not echo, it settled low and controlled, like a weight placed carefully into the center of the moment, and Officer Ryan Cole felt it before he processed it. A subtle drop in the tension that had been driving his actions, replaced not by relief, but by a different kind of awareness, one that forced him to reassess everything that had just happened in the span of seconds. His gaze moved from the leather credentials to the man holding them, then to Danielle, who now stood with her hands lowered, her posture unchanged in its calm precision, as if nothing about the encounter had surprised her, as if this had always been the direction it was heading, and that realization carried its own quiet impact. The overhead lights continued their steady hum, casting that same pale glow across the lot, but now the scene felt rearranged, the lines of authority no longer running in the same direction, no longer anchored where Cole had first placed them. The man closed the credential wallet with a soft, deliberate motion, slipping it back into his jacket without hurry. And when he spoke again, his tone remained even, not confrontational, not apologetic, just clear. "We are in the middle of an active operation," he said, each word measured, leaving no room for interpretation but also no need for emphasis, and Cole's shoulders shifted slightly, the tension in them loosening just enough to signal that he was listening now rather than directing. Danielle finally turned fully, her attention aligning with the man beside her, and though no introduction was made, no formal acknowledgement spoken, the connection between them was evident. In the quiet synchronization of their stance, their awareness, the way neither needed to explain the other's presence. Across the lot, the dark sedan remained where it had stopped, its engine still running, its silhouette unchanged, and yet now it carried a different meaning, no longer just another vehicle in transit, but a fixed point in the operation that had been unfolding long before the cruiser lights cut through the night. Cole followed Danielle's line of sight without realizing it, his gaze settling on the sedan, and for the first time, he saw it not as background, but as something deliberate, something placed, and the pieces began to align in his mind, not all at once, not with clarity, but enough to understand that the situation extended far beyond the narrow frame he had been operating within. The man beside Danielle took a step forward, subtle but intentional, positioning himself just enough to shift the center of control without forcing it. And Cole responded. Instinctively, not stepping back, but adjusting, his posture no longer pressing forward, his presence recalibrated to something more measured, more aware. "We need you to disengage from this interaction," the man continued, his voice steady, "and allow us to proceed." And there was no edge to the words, no authority asserted beyond what was already understood, just a statement of fact. Cole's jaw tightened briefly, not in resistance, but in the process of accepting the shift, the internal recalculation that came with recognizing when a situation was no longer his to command. And he nodded once, a small, controlled motion that carried more weight than any spoken agreement. Danielle remained still for a moment longer, her gaze steady on the sedan, her awareness fully aligned now with the operation as it moved into its next phase. And there was no visible transition, no outward signal, just a quiet shift in her presence, from holding the line to moving forward. The man beside her glanced at her briefly, not asking, not confirming, just acknowledging, and that was enough, because everything that needed to be said had already been understood without words. The night air moved again, lighter now, carrying the faint sound of footsteps from somewhere beyond the immediate scene, and the rest stop continued its quiet rhythm, unchanged to anyone passing through, unaware of the precise, controlled moment unfolding beneath the surface. Cole stepped back half a pace, not retreating but clearing space, his role shifting from center to edge, his attention still sharp, still present, but no longer driving the direction of the moment, and in that small adjustment, the final piece settled into place, the complete reversal of control happening not through force or confrontation, but through clarity, through timing, through the quiet authority of truth revealing itself exactly when it needed to. And as Danielle took her first step forward, measured and deliberate, the night seemed to open around her, no longer confined by the narrow boundaries of a roadside stop, but expanding into something larger, something that had been in motion long before any lights began to flash. Danielle's steps were quiet against the asphalt, measured and unhurried. Yet each one carried a precision that shifted the center of the scene with every inch she moved, and the distance between her and the dark sedan seemed to close not just physically, but with a kind of inevitability that had been building long before this moment. The overhead lights stretched thin reflections across the truck's polished surfaces, the faint hum of engines blending into a steady backdrop as the rest stop continued to exist around them, unaware, unchanged, and yet everything within this small circle of space had transformed, the lines of authority redrawn without a single raised voice. The man beside her remained just a step behind, not leading, not following, but aligned, his presence steady, reinforcing the quiet shift that had already taken place, and Officer Ryan Cole stood where he had moved, just off to the side now, his posture no longer pressing forward, his gaze tracking Danielle with a focus that had changed from suspicion to something more complex, something closer to recognition. Across the lot, the sedan's engine idled softly, its headlights now dimmed but still casting a faint glow that reflected off the painted lines of the parking space, and as Danielle approached, a figure inside shifted slightly, just enough to confirm awareness, just enough to signal that the moment had reached its point of contact. She stopped a few feet from the vehicle, her posture relaxed but grounded, her presence controlled in a way that did not demand attention but held it naturally, and for a second, the world seemed to narrow again, not into tension, but into clarity, the kind that comes when everything aligns. Exactly as it should. The passenger door opened slowly, the motion smooth and unhurried, and the person inside stepped out, their movements calm, deliberate, offering no sudden change, no escalation, just a quiet acceptance of what was unfolding, and Danielle's gaze met theirs, steady, unflinching, not confrontational, just certain. There were no loud commands, no dramatic gestures, only a few low words exchanged between them, voices kept even, controlled, the kind of conversation that carried more meaning in tone than in volume, and behind them, the man who had identified himself earlier watched carefully, his attention fixed not on control, but on confirmation, ensuring that each step followed the exact path it had been set on. The night air moved lightly again, brushing across the open space between vehicles, carrying the faint scent of fuel and dust, and somewhere in the distance, a truck horn sounded briefly before fading into silence, a reminder that the world beyond this moment continued without pause. Danielle reached into her jacket with a movement as deliberate as everything else she had done, retrieving a small item and holding it just low enough to remain within view of the person in front of her, the gesture simple, controlled, and the response was immediate, not with resistance, but with understanding, a subtle nod, a shift in posture that signaled alignment rather than opposition. Behind them, Cole watched the exchange, his perspective now completely altered, the earlier certainty replaced by a quiet realization of how close he had come to disrupting something far beyond his initial understanding. And though he said nothing, the weight of that realization settled into his stance, into the way he held himself at the edge of the scene. The man near him spoke briefly into a device at his side, his voice low, measured, relaying information that did not need to be heard to be understood, and within seconds, the environment responded in subtle ways, not with flashing lights or raised voices, but with small, coordinated movements that rippled outward beyond the immediate frame. Danielle stepped slightly to the side, allowing space, her role shifting. Once more, not away from control, but into a different form of it, one that guided rather than confronted, and the person from the sedan followed that unspoken direction, their movements calm, their posture cooperative, as if the outcome had been decided long before this meeting ever took place. The tension that had once defined the encounter did not vanish, it transformed, settling into something quieter, more contained, the kind of resolution that does not need to announce itself because it is already complete. And as the scene continued to unfold with steady, controlled motion, the rest stop returned to its normal rhythm around them, the hum of engines, the flicker of lights, the quiet passage of travelers, all unchanged on the surface, while beneath it, something precise and deliberate had reached its conclusion exactly as it was meant to. The movement around the sedan slowed into something quieter, more contained, as if the night itself had decided to lower its voice, and Danielle stood just off to the side now, her presence no longer the focal point of tension but the quiet center of resolution. Her posture relaxed yet precise, every detail of her stance reflecting a control that did not need to assert itself. The person who had stepped out of the vehicle remained calm, compliant, their earlier uncertainty replaced by a steady acceptance of the situation, and the man who had approached from behind, now clearly part of a larger, coordinated effort, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that carried finality without spectacle. Officer Ryan Cole remained near the edge of the scene, his position unchanged physically, but entirely different in meaning, his gaze moving from Danielle to the sedan and back again, the earlier confidence in his assumptions replaced by a deeper, quieter understanding, one that settled into him without words. The overhead lights hummed softly, casting their pale glow across the lot, and the distant highway continued its steady rhythm, the low rush of passing vehicles blending into the background as if nothing significant had occurred, as if this moment was just another passing second in an ordinary night. Danielle turned slightly, her attention shifting back toward the truck, her role now complete in a way that required no acknowledgement, no recognition beyond the silent alignment of events that had unfolded exactly as intended, and as she walked, her steps remained measured, unhurried, each one carrying the same calm precision that had defined her from the beginning. The man behind her spoke quietly into his device again, his voice low, controlled, relaying what needed to be said without drawing attention. And, within moments, the subtle signs of coordination began to dissolve into stillness, the small movements that had once signaled action now fading back into the ordinary patterns of a rest stop at night. Cole watched Danielle as she reached the side of her truck, his expression thoughtful now, not burdened but reflective, the kind of look that comes when a person recognizes the limits of their own perspective, and for a brief second, their eyes met again, not as opposing sides, not as authority and subject, but as two people who had stood at the center of the same moment from very different positions. Danielle did not speak, and neither did he, but something passed between them in that silence. Something quieter than apology and stronger than explanation. A simple recognition of what had been, and what had almost gone wrong. She climbed back into the cab with the same steady motion as before, the door closing with a soft, solid sound that seemed to settle the last of the tension into place, and inside, the familiar space welcomed her without change, the dashboard lights glowing faintly, the engine humming low beneath her, a constant, grounding presence. Outside, the sedan no longer held the same weight it had before, its role completed, its presence now just another vehicle in a place designed for movement and pause, and the man who had stood beside her stepped back. His part in the moment concluded with the same quiet efficiency with which it had begun. Cole remained where he was for a moment longer, his posture still, his gaze lingering on the truck as if trying to hold onto the understanding that had just formed, before finally stepping back toward his cruiser, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as though each step carried a new awareness he had not possessed minutes earlier. The red and blue lights no longer flashed, their absence leaving the night softer, less defined, and as Danielle adjusted her grip on the wheel, her eyes forward once more, the road ahead stretched out in the same quiet certainty it always had, mile after mile of open highway waiting without question.